Should jewelry production be publicly owned or privately owned? This is probably a much easier case, and this is why we're finishing with it. A previous video covers these 5 principles for determining whether a sector should be publicly or privately owned. Very briefly, the first is natural monopoly. If a sector forms a natural monopoly, then it favors public ownership. If not, then private. If it's more competitive, then probably private ownership is best. The second principle is physical survival. In this one, if the sector produces a good or service that's necessary for physical survival, this favors public ownership. But if it is a luxury item or something unnecessary, then it favors private ownership. The third principle is the percentage of the population. This one is the higher the percentage of people in society that use a product or service produced by a sector, the greater the argument in favor of that sector being publicly owned. The fourth principle is inequity risk. This one says that if there is a high risk of inequity arising in society from a sector being privately owned, then it probably should be publicly owned. The fifth principle is non-economic benefits. This one says that if a sector produces something that has a lot of non-economic benefits, those are benefits that are very hard to measure in financial terms, that this favors public ownership. Whereas the more quantifiable something is in financial terms, the more this favors private ownership. So let's apply these 5 principles to the jewelry production sector. We could include jewelry production to include everything from mining the minerals and ores and stones out of the ground, but because a lot of the core resources that go into jewelry, such as the metals, are also used in other sectors, this doesn't make as much sense. So let's look at jewelry production after the resources have been acquired and people are putting together pieces of jewelry. Jewelry production does not really represent a natural monopoly because the barriers to entry are not very high. Someone can simply start buying resources or use things around them to make jewelry and sell it. But there is a risk, of course, that firms can grow larger and form cartels or end up in very anti-competitive situations, especially within certain subsectors. And here we enter back into the mining sectors. It is possible to have monopolies form around particular materials or raw resources, such as diamonds, which is a good example because it actually happened. This implies there is a need for monitoring the concentration of ownership within the jewelry production sector, but it's not a good enough argument in favor of public ownership of enterprises operating within the sector. The sector is very competitive. It has low barriers to entry in most areas. The products of the jewelry production sector are certainly not needed for physical survival. They are very much purely discretionary purchases. No one is going to die without jewelry. When we look at the percentage of the population that uses jewelry, it's reasonably high, but it's nowhere near 100%. Only a portion of the population use jewelry. When we look at the inequity risk, it's quite low. Sure, someone could have a lot of jewelry and someone else could have very little jewelry, and jewelry could get very expensive, but the material suffering that's experienced from that inequity is quite minimal. It could be quite real in certain limited circumstances, but I would say the inequity risk is quite low. When we look at the non-economic benefits of jewelry, there are some, but they're quite limited. There's sentimental value of jewelry, and jewelry can serve certain cultural functions, but overall the non-economic benefits of jewelry are not as high as the non-economic benefits of other sectors. Taking all these things into consideration and applying the 5 principles, we can come to an easy conclusion that jewelry production should be privately or collectively owned. The argument in favor of public ownership of any firms within this sector is very weak, and probably we should not have any publicly owned firms producing jewelry. This seems like a very common sense, and I think many people would agree. The point of having these 5 principles is to guide our common sense and have something to rest it on, to be able to make good arguments for why private ownership is good in one sector, but bad in another sector. Within jewelry production, the role of government should simply be to prevent cartels from forming and to prevent monopolies from forming. There is no good argument for having public ownership in the jewelry sector. Innovation and choice are much better served by having private enterprises compete with each other in this sector. Many sectors will be like jewelry in the sense that they produce goods that are not necessary for physical survival, they're highly competitive, there's little risk of inequity or material inequity. They don't provide too much non-economic benefit. And for these sectors, it's safe to say that exclusively having private ownership is fine. Public ownership should be reserved for sectors of the economy that matter more, that are needed for survival, that everyone uses, where there's no elasticity in the demand for the products or services,